coming up.
I've broken some rules to make this. Carbon fiber and titanium, there's a rule you don't do that. Well, I did.
You don't move fast and break things if the thing you're going to break has got you inside it.
Not what we thought. A year on from the Titan tragedy,
We knew right where the sub was.
James Cameron reveals
Tapping sounds. Tapping sounds are ridiculous.
what really happened at the bottom of the ocean.
The entire world waiting with bated breath. We all knew they were dead.
So the Coast Guard lied. Hello and welcome back to the 60 Minutes podcast, Extra Minutes. I'm Amelia Adams. It's great to have your company and also to be joined today for the first time by our producer extraordinaire, Hannah Bowers. Welcome.
Thank you.
Now, you and I have been covering the tragedy and mystery of the Titan submersible since it imploded in June last year.
That's right.
And we have spoken to, I guess, key players in that industry, the submersible industry, the deep sea exploration industry. And then just in these past 2 weeks, the hearings we have been waiting for.
Absolutely.
And they were really quite thorough and explosive.
Absolutely, and really damning of Oceangate. And a lot of, I guess, what you spoke about with these experts in our story so far was laid bare for everyone to hear.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it goes back to the Oceangate CEO, Stockton Rush, who we know was killed with 4 others in the implosion, and his attitude. He wanted to push boundaries. He wanted to take risks. And there was a lot of testimony to that effect, wasn't there?
Absolutely. And what really emerged was this narrative, which I think came through in your interviews previously as well, of this notion of profit over safety at all costs. And from all the experts we've spoken with, when it comes to this deep sea exploration, safety has to be number one, and it just wasn't for Oceangate.
The Titan had dived to the Titanic site 10 times previously, but Stockton Rush was so determined to get paying passengers on board, who they called mission specialists, which we'll unpack in a moment, and start to make a profit.
Absolutely.
That he just, as we heard in the hearings, and a lot of these experts' words, rushed and cut corners. It's important to point out that the hearings are not a trial.
No.
It's a fact-finding mission, isn't it?
No, that's right. Some of it did feel like quite a performance, I guess, hearing from some quite colourful characters, people we haven't heard from before and have been waiting to hear from. And I think from the moment, I guess, this story unfolded and there were these, banging noises, the whole thing has had this air of a bit of a media circus about it. So I think there definitely was a really strong interest in these 2 weeks of testimony and what we've learned.
All right, well, let's get stuck into that. But first, just quickly, let's have a look at the vision that we've also been waiting for, which is the footage of what the remotely operated vehicle that was sent down to find the wreckage found 4 days after the Titan went missing. Now, we interviewed
Ed Cassano.
Ed Cassano, who's the CEO of the company that owns that vessel. It's the only vessel that was capable of diving nearly 4 kilometres down to the Titanic site.
It's a long way.
And you can see when you look at this vision why that was such an eerie experience for the crew operating that vessel. Ed also described that moment when they came across what we're seeing now, which is it's the tail cone is all that survived, which is the non-pressurised section of the hull, which had, to my understanding, support equipment like batteries and communication stuff in it. So it didn't fail. It was literally separated from the pressurised hull that imploded. And so that's what we're seeing in this vision.
That's right. And this vision, you've got to remember, was so important because up until this point where Ed and his team saw this vision, there was some element of had they survived, what actually has happened. But
Could
this
they
was,
still find them?
Absolutely. But this was just that undeniable proof that, no, they had met their end down the bottom there. And I think we're often so used to seeing that vision of the Titanic wreckage down there. And so it was just so eerie to actually see that footage. I guess you've got to also remember there were 5 people on board that perished.
Yes, and families waiting up on the surface. And that was the moment that you're seeing that it really shifted from obviously a search and rescue operation into a recovery mission. One of the most damning witnesses in these hearings was David Lockridge.
Yes.
And you and I have spoken to so many people on camera and on the phone, on background, close to Oceangate, the US Coast Guard. David Lockridge is the one person. He's the former operations director at Oceangate. He was fired by them. We'll get into that. He's the one person that had not spoken publicly.
No.
He refused to do any media here or in America.
Yep.
So to hear him for the first time sit and describe what he said was a disaster waiting to happen, I found really compelling.
He didn't hold back at all. I don't think he really doubled down on what he really had raised concerns about years before this tragedy. So it's not really something you want to be vindicated about. This isn't something he wanted to happen. He actively tried to stop it from happening. And as you said, he was fired for doing that. So hearing from him that he had no confidence whatsoever in the Titan being able to do what it was proposed to do, it was damning.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We covered that in some detail in our first story not long after the tragedy. He actually wrote a report first to Oceangate executives, so this is 2018, outlining all of his concerns. And the key concern, and he had a whole list of them, he said Oceangate would cut ties with anyone who criticised their processes. Stockton Rush was inexperienced, impatient rather, and hired inexperienced engineers. Made a lot of cost-cutting decisions, cut corners. But at the heart of his concerns were the carbon fibre hull.
Absolutely, and the integrity of that. It's not made for those deep dives.
Yeah.
It's just not.
So for people like us, before this happened, when we first took up this story, we had no idea.
No.
Because we're not submersible experts, although we've tried to become them, that the industry standard is steel-lot titanium. I mean, to withstand the pressure of diving 4 kilometres under the water.
And repeatedly. That is the key thing there as well.
That's an excellent point.
Stockton's aim was to make this a tourist venture. He wanted to monetize it. He wanted to be first. He was pushing those boundaries, and he did whatever it took to get there faster and to dodge whatever recommendations people that did have this experience, like David Lockridge, around safety, around maritime operations. And yes, sadly, we saw the consequences of that.
Another very outspoken person who we interviewed last year, who was very, very concerned about the carbon fibre hull, was Carl Stanley. He knew Stockton Rush for a long time, and he dove with the company in 2019, and he was alarmed. He described to us in that interview, hearing cracking sounds as they dove.
And he went through that dive again at the hearings. And I think when he originally described it to you, he described it like gunshot noises going off. And that was actually the hull cracking is what he later learned.
So imagine you're under the water and you're in a submersible and you hear these noises.
No.
I mean, those are the concerns that he also, after that dive, raised with Stockton Rush.
That's the thing, there's such a
in
paper
phone
trail,
calls, in
isn't
emails.
there? Yeah.
And as we know, that led to their relationship being extremely strained because Stockton Rush didn't want to hear it.
Yeah, and Carl even admitted at the hearings, initially it was exciting, this prospect, and he was excited by it, but then in hindsight, there were so many red flags. And going on that dive did not feel safe. And he raised that concern directly with Rush and was rebuffed.
Remember, he said to us, I think Stockton was designing a mousetrap for billionaires.
Gosh, that was quite a quote, wasn't it?
Yeah, and the other one, he said, he definitely knew it would end like this. Who was the last person to murder billionaires and have them pay for the privilege? I mean, he was scathing that this was absolutely always going to be the end result of Stockton Rush's impatience in his venture.
Yeah, and he did sort of reiterate that at the hearings as well. He said that Stockton always wanted to leave his mark, and he did that, and he sadly left it on the industry as well.
The flip side of all this, of course, Hannah, and you and I have discussed this so much, is that it is an industry where you do need innovation. And you do need people to be pushing boundaries. And, I mean, isn't all adventure and exploration about testing the limits of what humankind can achieve?
And that is the push and pull here that we have sort of discovered. I mean, you've interviewed Rob McCallum. He's a deep sea explorer. He's been to the Titanic many, many times. You've interviewed James Cameron as well. And I think the number one thing that came through in both of their interviews was breaking records is amazing and it's what they live for, but you've got to do it safely. Otherwise, if you don't come home from the record, then it doesn't mean anything.
I think James Cameron was one of my favourite interviews of this year. Wasn't he great?
Well, he's someone that was not interviewed at the
By the
at
Coast
the
Guard.
hearings.
True.
Yes.
Yeah, and he was a bit annoyed about that too, wasn't he? When we
didn't hold
asked
back,
him
did he?
if he'd
Yeah.
be giving testimony at these hearings, he said, "No, I'm still waiting for the phone call." And I mean, he is obviously not only a Hollywood acclaimed director and whatnot, but he is an absolute expert in the field of submersible engineering, construction, and exploration. So he is someone that you would have thought the Coast Guard would be very keen to talk to in this investigation.
Yeah, and there were sort of dozens of people sort of that we heard from over the past 2 weeks. I mean, I guess they had to contain it in some way, but we were certainly very interested to hear what James Cameron had to say on this.
For you, what were the key things that have come out of these hearings? I mean, for me, it's reaffirmed what some of the initial kind of claims and sweeping statements that were put out there, that everyone said, we're going to hold on, there's going to be a full investigation. In fact, there have been several inquiries. Then we're going to have public hearings. I think these hearings, for me, definitely confirmed, the carbon fibre hull was not built to withstand the pressure repeatedly. It wears over time. I think the hearings confirmed that those passengers probably did not know that they were about to die. It would have been so fast.
Yes.
And that's something that's always been thrown around as a bit of a question. Would they have had those final moments knowing they're about to die? So that was probably quite comforting for their families.
Yeah, and interestingly, the Coast Guard did confirm sort of the last communication that those on board did actually make with the mothership during this expedition. And I think those words were all good here. And so that's the last thing that people on board sort of heard from them.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. There was speculation at the time that they tried to make a return to the surface and that they dropped weights for that reason. But I think that was worked out during the hearings that no, it was probably instantaneous. And while they didn't totally confirm exactly how it happened, that's still going to be worked through, I think, in the final report. I think interestingly, Jamie Frederick, who you had interviewed from the Coast Guard.
Yes, so he was the Captain Jamie Frederick.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep, from
he
the
was
Coast
leading
Guard.
the US Coast Guard search, and anyone who followed the news story would have seen he was, he was the person giving the press conferences and updating the media and the public, hour by hour, really.
Oh, absolutely. And he confirmed what he told you in that there were reports of an implosion sound from naval intelligence, but it was classified and they couldn't communicate that to the public yet.
That's
so
right.
I think ultimately over the past 2 weeks, it was that confirmation that Oceangate was a company that did appear to put profits ahead of safety. There was a huge cost to that. And ultimately, with a lot of hindsight, but then maybe not. There were red flags raised continuously along the way, and we heard from people that did confront Stockton Rush about their concerns, that it was ultimately an accident waiting to happen.
Yeah. I guess part of these hearings as well is certainly to find out, as we've discussed, what went wrong.
Yes.
To avoid this happening again in future, but also to raise, how does the industry continue? How do we keep building these submersibles, keep pushing the limits, keep exploring so much of the deep ocean that, as James Cameron told us, is yet to explore, and he's almost done it all. And how is that to be done safely? And this did have, as we know, such a big impact on the industry and on deep sea tourism.
And potentially unfairly. They were such an outlier.
Yeah.
And I think that's what came across in a lot of the people that you spoke to as well, that ultimately most of the other players in this industry are doing things the right way. He was in such a rush, not unironically being called Stockton Rush, but he was in such a hurry to sort of get to where he wanted to go that he did just cut corners when it came to safety. It wasn't a classed submersible. He didn't sort of go to those extra measures. As you said, he called people mission specialists so that he could take passengers on board but actually have them as employees. So
that came up in the hearings as well, which seems to be a bit of a go-round, really.
Absolutely.
Because if you're giving people the title of mission specialist, you are intimating that they are crew members.
That's right.
When in fact, we know who's on board, 2 billionaires, and these are people who paid a lot of money for an adventure.
that's right.
They're not qualified crew if something were to go wrong
No.
by any means.
No, absolutely. And, the training they received, while they might have received a few days' worth, it's certainly not to qualify you in any way. There was a teenage boy on board.
Yeah.
So I think that workaround probably angered a lot of people in the immediate aftermath, learning that that people probably didn't realise the risk that they were signing up for in some ways. To be fair, the waiver that they signed did mention, I think you wrote in your original
remember
story.
the first time we read it, it was like, you might die, you might die, you might die.
Multiple times.
Which you'd expect, I guess. I mean, there are so many companies globally that offer deep sea tourism, and I didn't realise until this happened how big the industry is and how safe the industry is.
Yes.
Remember James Cameron saying to us, if you look at the data, there's much more chance of you dying in a crash with your Uber driver than dying in a submersible. It doesn't happen. It hadn't happened for so long. And there's a reason for that, as you say, because protocols and regulations were followed. Oceangate was trying to do something different. He was, by his own admission, experimental. He wanted to do something no one else had done, and he wanted to do it quickly, and he wanted to make a profit out of it. That said, if I was booked on another really safe, well-known company when the Oceangate thing happened, I probably would have cancelled my ticket. Like, I can really see why it has impacted the whole industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another point that Rob McCallum made, deep sea explorer Rob McCallum made, is that it's a big ocean out there. And yes, there is this incredible allure to see the Titanic wreckage with your own eyes, but there's actually a lot of other places to explore, and hopefully people do get that back again, and it does build back up safely. And his suggestion was that perhaps the Titanic should be left alone.
That's right. Yeah, he did say that. He feels like there's been enough movies, enough documentaries, enough visits to it. Interestingly, when we put that to James Cameron, and this is a man who's dived 33 times, James Cameron?
It was just a few less than Paul Henry.
That's right, of course. Yeah, his dear friend who died. So I think it was 33 or 34 times that James Cameron's been to the Titanic wreckage, and we put that to him and said, is it enough? Like, do we leave this side alone? And he said, exploration will proceed because it must, and it's part of the human spirit. I love this quote. He said, a knucklehead that made a mistake shouldn't be holding everyone else back, and it won't. We have plans to build a sub that can go to 4,000 metres. And he said, I may go back to the Titanic in that sub just to prove that it can and it will be done safely again. So he's certainly not ready to.
Might be another documentary in that or something.
There might be as well, but there's more to explore, to your point.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I think ultimately when it comes to, I guess, this saga and people's ongoing sort of interest in it, it does have all those elements. You've got hubris, you've got human ambition, you've got flawed characters, you've got that incredible sort of history of the Titanic. And now, sadly, you've got another wreckage. Tragedy. They'll be entwined forever.
And there is the argument that, we need the Stockton Rushes. We need those people who will push the boundaries and test the limits so we know what not to do in future. But then, of course, 4 other people have lost their lives.
Yes, you're taking others with you.
We spoke at length with Sidonie Nargeolet, who's the daughter of Pierre-Henri Nargeolet. He is also a very famed deep-sea explorer, good friends with James Cameron. And she said that obviously she's devastated, but that her father made a choice. This was a trip that he wanted to do, and ultimately, though it sounds like a cliche, Pierre-Henri really did die doing what he loves. I wonder how Sidonie, and we should ask her, and the other families have responded to these hearings, how they would have taken this information, because ultimately it might answer some questions, but, it's not going to bring their loved ones back.
No, that's the sort of the sad reality of this situation. And as much as we can wait for the report, we ultimately know how it ended. It's just a matter of how that actually came about and confirming those steps. So as you said, it can be avoided in future.
So what's the timeline now on the report? Because these hearings, as we said, could go some way to potentially recommending charges.
That's right.
But we're waiting, really, aren't we, for the overarching report, which was due out. This keeps getting pushed back.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to see that until mid-next year, according to reports. But as you said, there's multiple sort of investigations that are ongoing.
Yes.
And this sort of Marine Board investigation and these hearings are, while they've had that 2 weeks, it could be some time before we see a comprehensive report.
Yeah, and that would then lead to potentially charges for Oceangate, although, as Sidonie Nargeolet said, the man really responsible is also at the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah, that's the irony in this situation.
All right, well, we wait for the report. It's a fascinating story, and I think the interest in it only gets deeper and deeper, pardon the pun, with everything that we learn about this tragedy. Hannah, thank you so much.
Thank
and if
you,
you
Amelia.
did miss either of our stories on the Titan submersible tragedy, you can catch up on our YouTube channel and on 9 Now. We'll see you next time on the podcast.